Hello and good evening. Although tonight's topic and the discussion we're about to have is about business ethics, or maybe perhaps specifically because we're talking about ethics, I really feel the need to mention in a few moments just how we at H New York and personally we feel the pain and the suffering of the blatant racism that exists today in the world. We must stand up to hate. We must eradicate all types of racism, and we must really educate about love and tolerance. We can't be silent. And please God, with our efforts, we will soon see a wider world of ethics and morality and equality for all. So what I wanted to speak about tonight, in Jewish terms, it's actually referred to as Genevet Daat, the theft of somebody's mind. A fascinating article that I found, not necessarily in the most intellectual of sources, but in the Daily Mail in England. An article recently ran about a court case in China where a man was actually rewarded the equivalent of £75,000 for against a trial against his wife. Basically, a couple had a child, and the baby didn't really look anything like the husband. But unfortunately, it really didn't look anything like the wife either. And the husband accused his wife of having an affair, because since it didn't look like either of them, there must have been somebody else in the relationship, which caused this child to look, whose DNA, to have this child look so radically different than each of the parents. She denied it, and eventually what she admitted was that she had had an enormous amount of plastic surgery to look the way she did today. And this child did in fact look like her, just not like her present self. Now, I'm not getting into the court ruling. This is not a class about Chinese law and its incredible misogynistic view rewarding with the man. I'm not getting into that. But the concept really that really springs to mind and really requires a little bit of thought is in fact this wife required to reveal to her husband the plastic surgery that she's had? Is her presentation of self today okay? Are you allowed to sort of present one thing and then give something different? This child certainly did look like her, but just a different version of herself. Did she need to tell him? Is that a false impression of who she really is? And I guess really there are so many examples of this in business and advertising, or really anywhere, when something looks like one thing, but the exchange is really for something else. And that's really what we're going to be looking at today. So the first thing is, the first source that I want to take a look at, we just came across the festival of Shavuot just passed, and the Torah, and we celebrate, the giving of the 10 Commandments. One of the most famous commandments is one of the 10 Commandments, one of the top 10, where the Torah tells us, Lo tignov. It's in Exodus chapter 20, where the Torah tells us, you shall not steal. But the Torah that really prides itself in not repeating itself and not saying anything unnecessarily, again, in Leviticus later, it actually says the prohibition of stealing again, but this time it actually says it in slightly different version. It says, Lo tignovu, which is in the plural, you shall not steal. And the Ritva, one of the famous commentaries of the Talmud, he was actually from Seville in Spain, born in the mid-13th century, about 1250. He actually says something amazing. He says that we learn from the plural nature of the second prohibition. The first says, don't steal, lo tignov, and then it says, lo tignovu, the plural in Hebrew of don't steal. He actually says the second prohibition is actually including the concept of not just physical stealing, not just taking something physical from someone, whether it be money or an item from someone, but also to include the prohibition of Genevet Daat, misleading one in thought, stealing something, intellectual theft, taking something that really isn't tangible, but something that is in somebody's mind, and that's the prohibition, the second prohibition that the Torah is telling us. The Rabbeinu Yonah, Rabbi Yonah from Guerandi in Catalina, who also lived in the 13th century. He passed away around 1263. Shortly afterwards, the Ritva is writing his words, and he says that Genevet Daat, the idea of misleading one in thought as a form of falsehood, he actually says this comes from a different verse in Exodus, where the Torah tells us to distance oneself from a false matter. He also agrees that it's a biblical commandment not to steal one's thought, but he says it actually comes from a different verse that is one has to distance themselves from any false matter. So clearly this is actually a very important thing. And let's look at some of the practicalities. The oral tradition In the Tosefta of Baba Kama, one of the oral traditions in the Talmud, says that actually there are 7 types of thievery. And of these, the most serious one, according to the Talmud, is a person who steals from someone's mind. If someone steals from the minds of people, of the 7 types of thievery, this is the most severe of all of them. And the Talmud explains that really the reason that is so is that one can't repay someone's thoughts. Stealing someone's intellectual property is so severe because it's not tangible, and specifically because it's not tangible, since you can't repay it, since you can't give it back, it really has a severity beyond just physical things as well. Let's go a little bit further. The Talmud actually includes a couple of interesting stories here to teach us this lesson. The Talmud in Chulin tells us a story about the great Rabbi Shmuel. And he actually concludes very unequivocally this same idea from the Talmud, that one is forbidden to steal the mind of any man. And how does he gives an anecdote to show this? And he says that Shmuel had a ride on a ferry, on a boat. And he tells his assistant who was with him to please pay the owner of the boat with a chicken. That's what they had. They used to barter things. And he gives him a chicken. Now, the boat owner, who was not Jewish, by the way, assuming that since he got this chicken from this great rabbi, he assumed that it would be kosher. Now, this boat owner wasn't Jewish. As I mentioned, he didn't have to keep the laws of kosher. He was allowed to eat any chicken. But since he got it from the rabbi, he assumed that it was, in fact, kosher. But in fact, it wasn't. Shmuel told his assistant that he must tell the man that it's not. He couldn't go on without telling him and informing him the status of that chicken. This has nothing to do with him eating it. But the boat owner who wasn't Jewish would think that, oh, wow, this has an extra value. It's a kosher chicken, right? We know that kosher chickens are slightly more expensive than non-kosher chickens, right? So this boat owner would be thinking that he got more value as payment. And in fact, he wasn't required to give it. The not kosher chicken was enough payment. But even if he thought that he had a slightly more expensive item as payment, right? The payment, the value that he felt, or the appreciation that he felt towards the rabbi would be inappropriate. And Rabbi Shmuel said he has to let him know that this chicken is of actual less value and of normal value for the payment of the boat ride of a regular chicken. Based on this, we see that the Talmud says you can't trick anybody, even gaining value, even if no harm comes to them or nothing physically was taken from them. Nothing was taken from the merchant. He got what he was deserved. But if he thought that this was more valuable, you have to correct him, says Shmuel, and let him know the actual value of the thing that you gave him. The Talmud continues and tells us that Rabbi Meir says that a person should not urge his friend to have dinner with him if he knows that he's going to refuse. A person knows that they have plans already, pre-planned event or something. Don't invite somebody to join you for something. Don't invite your friend to go golfing if you know that they don't like golf, but they'll say, wow, you invited me to your club, etc. Rabbi Meir says you can't do that. He also says one should not offer a gift to somebody if they know they won't accept it. If somebody is allergic to cologne, don't offer them a gift that is going to be denied. One shouldn't open a barrel, says Rabbi Meir, of wine. And the way it worked used to be that they would take out smaller jugs from a barrel. So you shouldn't open a fresh barrel of wine, even though we know that aged wine is more valuable. But if you're going to open this barrel, obviously it's time for it to come out to the market. So you shouldn't open a barrel of wine, making somebody feel that you're doing that for his honor. And the reality is that the barrel was already sold and you have extra jugs to give out, so you're going to open it anyway. But if the person is tricked into thinking that you're opening this barrel for their sake, that's also a prohibition of stealing someone's thoughts and someone's mind, and that is a serious prohibition of false impressions. However, says the Talmud, even with the case of Shmuel, who says that you have to make sure the ferryman, the boat owner, knows the value of the payment. And even Rabbi Meir says you can't trick someone to inviting them to dinner or giving them a gift, even though you know they're not going to accept, or the barrel of wine that you're opening anyway. Even that's the case. However, this is a very big however, because it's a subtle, nuanced, subjective clause. Says the Talmud, if a person or the request that you're giving is to show the person honor, specifically you're doing it not to fool them or not to get something in return, but you're doing it purely for their honor, you're allowed to do it. And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rav Yosef Cairo, written in the late 1100s, in the 12th century, he actually writes that he will refuse even if a person will refuse, not because he seeks undeserved gratitude, but because you want to show the person honor, right? He actually says, according to Jewish law, we actually agree with this Talmud, and a person is allowed to give honor to somebody and do something, even if they will receive some undue respect. You're allowed to open that bottle of wine for them, or a barrel of wine for them, or even if you want to invite them to something purely for their honor, not so that you get something in return, then you would be allowed to do so. Okay, moving along. The Maharsha, Rabbi Shmuel Edlis, a renowned rabbi and Talmudist from the mid-1500s, he says a very interesting law. He says you should not sell shoes from the hide of an animal that died from old age, whilst claiming that they are from an animal that was actually slaughtered or produced from the animal that died, that we killed for its leather, so to speak. The slaughtered younger animal's hide is much stronger. The animal that died of old age, the hide is much weaker. So what the Maharsha is really saying is that you can't claim that this is from the younger animal when in fact it's from the older animal. Now, interestingly, that sounds like it might be actual theft, because if it's more valuable, maybe you're selling it for more money. But actually, he clarifies and says very interestingly, he says, even when the price is reasonable for the cheaper item, and that's what you're selling it for. Let's say the more expensive item would be $100 with the better leather, and you're selling it for $50. And it's actually valued at $50. That is what the leather is worth, but you're claiming that it's more expensive leather, and you're saying it's a 50% discount, we're going to give it to you for $50. He says, even though the value of the shoe is $50, and you're selling it for $50, but if you tell people the value is $100, what you're actually doing is stealing from their minds. Even though there's no monetary theft, you're still prohibited, because the prohibition of stealing from one's mind, the seller has earned undeserved gratitude from the buyer who believes that he's receiving a bargain. And that's really an amazing thought process that we have here, that allowing someone or letting somebody think that they're getting something of more value is stealing of minds. And that's the prohibition of Genevet, Daat, stealing from somebody's mind and thoughts. The Talmud in Bava Metzia, in Tosefta actually, in the 3rd chapter, says another interesting law. And it says that a storekeeper is not allowed to sprinkle his store with superior wine or oil. If you're selling, cheaper wine, or you're selling cheaper oil, and you have one expensive bottle of wine that you open and you sprinkle it around the store, one, expensive bottle of oil that you use to douse around and allow people to think, oh, look at that smell, look at that, the aroma, right? And even though you're selling the cheaper one and you're getting the right price for the cheaper one, just by causing the aroma to upscale the sale of what you're actually selling, according to the Tosefta, you're stealing people's minds, and that is prohibited. Okay, let's move to some more practical examples. In Israel, I don't know if anywhere else that this exists, but I've certainly seen it in Israel. There are wedding halls that have multiple venues within the same area. They might share a kitchen to cut costs down, and they could often be having a number of different events, sometimes a number of weddings, sometimes something else happening, a bar mitzvah year, a celebration there, a 50th wedding anniversary in one room, something else going on in another room, different things happening in different parts of the hall. So a friend of mine asked me the following question. He went to his father-in-law's 70th birthday party in one of these halls. And sure enough, as he gets there, he sees somebody he knows and he asks what they're doing there. And it turns out that a neighbor of his, who's not a close friend, but a neighbor who actually he didn't even write it down in his calendar. It turns out that they were making a wedding in one of the halls near his father-in-law's birthday party. So literally he parks the car in this parking lot. And, he realizes that he has a chance to go in. Now, his neighbor told him, maybe stop in for dessert, come inside, and we'll dance a little bit for my child's wedding. And, he's really there for his father-in-law's, birthday party. So he's debating if he's allowed to go in. And the man will think that he is coming special for him and feel so appreciative and etc. So he asks me what he's allowed to do. And I actually gave it some thought. And I found amazing Gemara, Talmud, that speaks almost exactly this scenario. The Talmud in Chulin tells us that a great rabbi called Mar Zutra was traveling from town A to town B. Now, at the same time, two other great rabbis, Rava and Rabbi Safra, they were also going to town B. Now, they met up, and Mar Zutra, the first rabbi, who was traveling alone, he assumed that the two other rabbis, these sages, had come specifically to greet him and to meet him. So he said, wow, it's so amazing. You shouldn't have gone to all this trouble to come and greet me, right? Traveling was a bigger deal in those days, and these two rabbis meet up with him, and he's so thankful and appreciative. Now, the two rabbis have a bit of a disagreement in the Talmud. Rabbi Safra felt obliged to explain to the first rabbi, Mar Zutra, that he didn't actually know that he was going to be there. He happened to come across him there, and he felt the need to explain to him that he wasn't there on purpose, but had he known he was coming, he would have, brought out the bells and the whistles and the red carpet and really greeted him properly. He apologized that he didn't know, because he would have greeted him with even more fanfare. But he did feel the need, and he expressed to the rabbi that he didn't actually know that he was going to be there. However, Rava, the second rabbi, said no. He thought that the disclaimer was unnecessary, since really they didn't do anything to deceive him. And in fact, Mar Zutra, the first rabbi, had deceived himself. He thought that because he was a great rabbi, they came to greet him. They didn't say they came special. They didn't say anything, and he really could have figured out that they happened to meet up and travel. That happens, right? So I actually wanted to say to my friend that since it's a known thing that these halls exist, that there's lots of people in many different areas, if you go and wish him a mazel tov and give him a beautiful hug, no reason that you have to express specifically, like Rava didn't feel the need, and I felt this was a similar case. If somebody fools themselves, yeah, that's actually on them. You didn't fool them, but they fooled themselves into thinking that you came special for them. And in fact, we do actually see in Jewish law that the Tosfot on the explanation of this Gemara says there's a logical difference between them. It says if there's a logical explanation as to what is going on, that the barrel of wine would be opening for the guest, for example, right? Then he might think that he's special, but you didn't know that he was sold. Then that, like Rav Safra felt, that the mistaken assumption has to be corrected. However, in the case of Mar Zutra, where there's no reason to assume when encountering people traveling on a road, they came to greet you. And if a person does that, that's upon them. It's sort of a buyer beware. It's on the person to be aware of the circumstance, and you are not required to actually correct them. The Shulchan Aruch in the Code of the Jewish Law brings this down as halacha, as Jewish law. And he says that if somebody is going to be correcting themselves or confusing themselves, one does not have to go out of their way in order to correct them. So we certainly see that we should all be striving to be as straightforward and honest in business as possible in all of our dealings. And these are some of the examples where it's a higher level of not just theft of items, but also theft of the mind. If a company marks down, sometimes you see, I've actually seen exposés where they show, in the factories where they're making clothing, they're already putting on the 50% tag sale off, right? So according to Jewish law, that seems to be a problem. If a company marks down clothes, or you sell a watch, at fake inflated prices and then give discounts on it, that seems to be stealing somebody's mind. You're allowed to have sales, but if you have to give the real impression of how much it's worth and how much you're willing to sell it for, and then that's okay. But if you come in with inflated prices or inflated ideas of some scenario that a person would never know without you correcting them, that seems to be a problem of false impressions and thievery of the mind. Another good example in real life is cheating on an exam. The proctor, the teacher, etc., and really actually down the line, maybe future employees are basing their understanding of who you are on an exam, relying on these truths, and therefore that would also perhaps be, even though you're not physically taking someone, stealing of the mind and false impressions. So these are just some of the ideas that the Torah instructs us. Be honest, don't steal, and then it tells us don't steal again. Not just money, but also minds. We have to be honest and successful and straight. Good luck, and thank you very much for joining me.